Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Hudson. I'm the Executive Director of Tudor Place, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the second program in our 2023 Landmark Lecture Series. We begin this evening with our Indigenous Land Acknowledgement Statement. Tudor Place respectfully acknowledges the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway people on whose ancestral homelands Tudor Place Historic House and Garden sits. We also celebrate the vibrant Native communities who make their homes in the DC area today. This year's lecture series is exploring the techniques used to center the stories of communities traditionally marginalized in historical narrative, to reveal how these techniques are leading to a more inclusive interpretation here at Tudor Place and at other historic sites. The Landmark Lecture Series is supported by an Inspire grant for small museums from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of IMLS. We're very pleased this evening to welcome Molly Kerr, whose program is entitled Shopping Stories, Revealing the Lives of the Enslaved. As had earlier, and I think you'll find her enthusiasm for this to be quite infectious. Molly explores ways to make more engaging the public, and her educational background is in cultural anthropology, studies at the University of Mary Washington, and public archaeology, where she studied at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. Her career includes archaeological field work with cultural management firms, adult education with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Also, the development of a database to identify and catalog the enslaved community at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and crowdsourced projects transcribing and conducting oral histories. Most recently, she has focused on store accounts from the 18th century for what they tell us about the people, places, events, and material culture in communities residing in Colchester and Alexandria, Virginia. Her primary interest is in developing ways to better interpret the past through the present, whether it be through direct instruction or digital media. Would you please join me in welcoming Molly Kerr?
Thank you all very much for joining this evening. I am quite excited to be able to talk to you, and hope that you will learn a little bit and maybe think about participating with me in the future. So make sure this little guy's on. All right, so ledgers. They can kind of be boring. They appear to not, because they're very structured, they can be a challenge to look at, to read, to understand. But they are gigantic, untapped resource for learning more about colonial history and more about U.S. history, because they cover every time period. Kind of back like you used to have a checkbook, this is very much like a checkbook. And so they are really helpful for, especially in a community like Alexandria, that really starts documenting well in 1784 with the local newspapers. Ledgers that go back into the 1750s give us a much longer story, give us a lot more information about what's going on. They capture the daily lives of both the rich and the poor, which is what also makes them kind of engaging, because we get to see a lot of times those who are historically underrepresented, whether they be, kind of a poor sailor who comes in just for the day off of a ship, or someone who is enslaved and is in town every day and goes back and forth from their home to the store. So tonight, I'm hoping to share with you my enthusiasm for ledgers or account books. I will apologize in advance if I get too far astray and I get all excited, because it's just one of those things that this has become my passion, and it's going to be a life's work. There is no doubt. I started as trying to do something small, and it has grown quite exponentially. But I'm also hoping, just as importantly, to be able to learn from you all through your questions at the end, because part of what my job is to figure out how to share this information with the public, and your questions help direct me going forward. All right, so I'm going to start with what the Shopping Stories Project is. It began as a crowdsourced transcribing partnership between George Washington's Mount Vernon and the Fairfax County Park Authority. At the time, Dr. Eleanor Breen, who's presently the city archaeologist in Alexandria, was an archaeological research fellow, and she was interested in trying to compare what George Washington was buying from London to what the folks here locally could buy. At the same time, the Fairfax County Park Authority got started, had just acquired some new county park lands that encapsulated part of what was known as Colchester at the time. And so these two projects kind of coalesced at the same time, conveniently with the desire to do some transcribing of the John Glassford and Company ledgers, which reside just not far from here at the Library of Congress. There are 71 reels of microfilm attached to this collection, and I focused on 11 of them. They cover from 1758 to 1769, and there are over 4,000 to date, over 4,000 crowdsourced transcripts of the pages that we focused on. We had over 300 volunteers help us with this transcribing effort, and so at that point, it shifted from Mount Vernon and Fairfax County Park Authority to my organization, History Revealed, with the attempt to finalize the editing of the documents, but also try to figure out how to interpret them and analyze them and make them more accessible for someone who might be interested in learning from them. And so that's kind of where we are today. And so History Revealed started with the editing and analyzation, but that's fun, but we like to keep going. So we realized that there were 11 additional ledgers that are attached to Alexandria at the New York Public Library. And so we applied for grants with the Omohundro Institute in Williamsburg and the Historic Alexandria Foundation to have these 11 ledgers digitized. And so at this point, we can now expand those stores from Robert Townsend Hoe, which were 1770 to 1802. We can now expand our shopping history for this community from 1758 to 1802. And there's a lot of overlap between the communities. So our hope is basically to be able to compare those consumer habits, those consumer shopping habits from before the American Revolution through the founding of the new republic. So in case you don't know where these places are that I'm talking about, Colchester no longer exists. It is along the Occoquan River there at the intersection of 95 Route 1. If you've ever been stuck in traffic, this is where you have been stuck in traffic. So it is down there on the lower part. And of course, Alexandria, being the counterpart to Georgetown, is a place that's probably much more familiar to you. Colchester was founded in 1753. It was made up of 42 one-half acre lots, similar to Alexandria, which was founded in 1749. So there were 42 one-half acre lots on 25 acres that belonged to one individual that founded Colchester. There's 60 acres for 3 individuals to create 84 lots is what Alexandria was originally focused on. So we know originally the approximate location of the store in Colchester was here on lot number 3. It belonged to Benjamin Grayson. Courtesy of the ledgers, we can learn all kinds of things about what that store looked like, what it was comprised of. And then we can also, again, from the ledgers, be able to tell similar stories of the Glassford store that was here in Alexandria on lot 31. And then our later store belonged to Robert Townsend Hoe and his associates, and it was on lot 51 and was interestingly rented from the widow Susanna Patterson. So what's fun about the ledgers is they give us the opportunity to tell us, in some cases, when they even built the store, how it was constructed, what materials were purchased and from whom, how many materials. You want to know how many shingles it takes to put on a roof? You can find that information in the ledgers. So as you can imagine, one too many. One of the challenges of ledgers is that 18th century handwriting. Cursive is a challenge, but it is something that can be overcome with just a little careful comparison. It's just patterns. You just have to, if you don't remember it from grade school, the bigger challenge is actually learning about the bookkeeping. Once you get the handwriting down, it's understanding what the two halves, two pages mean. So these ledgers are very much similar to the way accounting was done today. If anybody uses Mint or Quicken or QuickBooks or anything like this is the precursor to all those softwares that we use today. And just like today, when you pay your credit card bill at the end of every month, your bill comes due at a time very different from when you made all your purchases. And so we see that also with the ledgers, where we can see days and days and days of purchases and then a payment on a completely random different day. And you're like, how do these things work? So it requires both to be used together. But what is always nice about them is that the amount of money is the same on each page. So your debit page documents your purchases, your credit page documents your payments. Account books or ledgers were basically a legal document. They are required by the store managers to comprise all of this so that at the end of every calendar year, if someone hasn't paid their debts, they get taken to court. And this is the evidence that they used to be able to go to court. So there are store managers who, there is a whole court case, in fact, about a store manager who owed people a lot of money. So kind of the inverse of what we usually think of. And so his ledger books mysteriously disappeared under the cover of darkness. And so it's all documented in this court case. Conversely, what we see even more, which is what makes is interesting for me, is that I can go into the local courthouses and can actually keep up with when folks are being taken to court. I can actually track that and watch the court cases from the court side as well as what's happening from the ledger side. So as I mentioned, they are broken into two halves and they rarely ever line up. But those amounts are what help us know that we have the right pages, because often pages go missing. One page gets lost and all of a sudden your amounts don't line up. Well, now you know that your purchases and your payments aren't always the same, because as you can also tell, they don't always put the person's full name on one side. So this is literally a book with two sides, two halves. And today, we often look at them one page at a time because that's how they get digitized. But in reality, they were written to always be done together. And so it's one of those things that's hard for us sometimes to think about because we only see one half. The precursor to this is a day book or a journal, which we're also dealing with from some of those New York Public Library ledgers. And those give you each day's accounts. So literally who came in and the order in which they came in. So you can identify who the shopper was and when they came in. And I'm hoping eventually might even be able to tell the time of day that they came in by what their purchases were. Can we start to see patterns that way? But they are structurally have all the same information, but they often give us a lot more information, like who the shopper was. One of the things that I don't know if you can read this, but on April 3rd, 2 cash paid sundries per journal. That is the most boring line to read ever, because what are sundries? The nice part about the day book or the journal is you can learn what those sundries were or are, as the case may be. Okay, so we are currently, as I mentioned, in kind of a second phase with these new ledgers. So we're actually transcribing again. And this is where I'm hoping some of you might be as excited as I am by the end of this presentation and want to help. So we are using a platform called From the Page to transcribe those ledgers. Right now we have 5 of them that are available for transcribing. And again, courtesy of the Historic Alexandria Foundation, who gave us a sizable amount of money to be able to digitize these, we are excited to be able to share them. And what is nice about this platform is that once the transcript is complete, this platform will continue to host the image and the transcript, theoretically, as long as the organization exists. So even if I'm no longer transcribing, you will always be able to go back in to take a look at the transcripts. We also have one additional ledger for John Mills. And I don't know if anybody has been to Alexandria and um, has seen Shooter's Hill, but it is the precursor to Shooter's Hill. And if you want to get started with this, we are going to start working with Alexandria Archaeology over the summer to do actual transcribing in-person days. So if you don't like the idea of sitting at home in the middle of the night transcribing and want to participate with us, we would be excited to have you join us in person. So here is what it looks like when you start to transcribe. Because these documents are accounting, we do it in a spreadsheet, in essence, a spreadsheet format. We repeat things over and over and over again because we want it to stay connected to the objects that are being purchased. I don't know if you can tell, but the handwriting here looks a little different from the previous. One of the things that's interesting about these is you can start to learn more about the people. This is John Mills's ledger that has to do with Shooter's Hill and Alexandria, or has to do with his personal accounts and Shooter's Hill and its construction. But I am not entirely sure if John Mills is the author of these or not, but whoever it is learned how to write in the early 18th century because their handwriting is very different from what we see with the later ledgers. And so while every book doesn't have the same format and where things are on the page is different, the information that is contained down here remains the same the entire time. And so we've tried to give you plenty of tools to get started. You can pick your favorite day in a journal and go and transcribe that day. What was happening on this day in 1781? You can go in and take a look. If you are not sure what a word is, you can go look at what other people transcribed and how that looked so that you can have an opportunity to compare and contrast. Because as I said, it's really just a great big puzzle. Once you figure out what the pieces are, it all starts to come together. And so we've also got a glossary, we have abbreviation lists, we have indexes of names. We've tried to do everything that we can to make it as useful for you as possible. And one of the things that we're doing that a lot of times you don't see in transcripts is we are jumping straight to the end, and we are adding, when we know what an abbreviation is, we are immediately telling you what it stands for. And so we're doing that at the transcribing phase. And it helps, what I have learned over time is it helps the transcribers better understand when they can see what other people have found. Oh, that's what that abbreviation means. It helps them make more sense of it. So that's phase one. Phase two is still happening in the background. And this is part of one of the things that I'm focusing on with that research and analysis phase. So what we want to do is try to figure out a way to make all of these documents more accessible to everyone. So to dig deeper into them, we're trying to figure out what are the kinds of questions. Remember, I'm going to be interested in your questions at the end, because that's the kind of thing that helps me know and make sure that what we're creating will work. So if you're a genealogist, you may be interested in all the names. If you are at a house museum, you may be interested in all the objects because you want to know what someone may have purchased to put in their house. If you're an archaeologist, you're really focused on what all the items are. My fantasy is to be able to find someone who purchased something at one of the stores that we can find where that person lived, archaeologically dig up the artifact that was purchased at the store, and to be able to make a complete through line. You know, from it was imported from here, it got sold at the store on this date, it must have broken in this layer, and then it was excavated on this date and rediscovered, and here it is. So we're trying to figure out ways through shopping stories to help us create that through line. Someday, I hope that that will happen. So the Glassford ledgers are in edit. So our hope is basically to be able to figure out a way to put those what will become over 9,500 pages into an online database that will allow you to search. So we are trying to figure out how to not only do basic searches looking for an object, but also how are those connected and who else purchased them. So kind of looking at it both visually, but then also with words. And what's exciting about this is I'm actually doing this with a partnership with the University of Central Florida. They have a computer science senior design class that this is the kind of thing that they're required to do. So we're in hoping, again, knocking on wood, and the next couple of weeks to basically relaunch an updated version of this that will start to enable you to be able to do these kinds of searches as we start loading more and more information into it. All right, so that's all the background. You can see how excited I am already. And this is just the day-to-day stuff. This is the day-to-day grind. So what I really want to do is talk to you about the stories that can be discovered when you actually start looking in the ledgers. So we're going to start with data because, in fact, this is one of the things that folks almost always ask me. Can you tell me, did my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather shop in your store, kind of thing? So when we think about people of the past, we're usually thinking about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Peter. We're not thinking about all the other people who were living their lives. I hope that someday someone remembers my name, but I am not expecting it. And this is a place where someone might be able to learn about all those people. So a lot of the documents that we find today are for folks like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. They are not for folks like me. And so this is one of the things that is fascinating about these is we can get a sense of the everyday lives of everyday people who often don't appear in the history books. And one of the groups of people who there is a limited amount of information is African Americans. And so overcoming those census walls, this is a resource that just gives us a lot more opportunities because we can see all kinds of folks, especially those who were enslaved and free African Americans, moving through the ledgers. And so, it's kind of a window, shall we say, that we can open up. So many of the account books include indexes. So we went through the indexes and created a master index for the Glassford ledgers. And then because the indexes are incomplete, we went page by page and documented every single account holder we found in all 11 ledgers. So as you can tell, we found a lot of accounts over those pages. And so it covers basically, again, from 1758 to 1769. We've got a lot of people who were in there. And while there is definitely still some duplication, we tried to streamline it the best we can. We do know that there are at least 4 Henry Bogesses. So if you are a genealogist and you hit those names and you're like, how do I tell them apart? We can start to do that based on their purchase patterns and when they purchased and who purchased and what they purchased and how they may or may not be connected to each other. One of the most challenging things is junior and senior do not mean the same thing that they do today. They often just mean the entries into the ledger. Sometimes it's not even age. So you have to start comparing from book to book to be able to tease them apart. And our hope is to start being able to merge the Robert Townsend Hoe materials in here soon as well, because we're starting to finalize those indexes as well. So whereas we initially focused just on the account holders, we have been researching specifically the 1760 to 61 Colchester store, in which we have found an additional 180 people who were not account holders, but were shoppers or mentioned in the store. So we have well over 600 free and enslaved individuals in that 1 year. We have looked at the very first of the Robert Townsend Hoe and Stone and Company ledger for 70 to 73. And we have identified an additional 258 names, giving us nearly over 500 shoppers in Alexandria over that 3-year period. So what can we find if we focus just on those who were enslaved? So in looking through the John Glassford and Company ledgers, we have 6 enslaved men and women with their own store accounts, independent of their enslavers. 4 men, Davy, Will, and Jack. 2 women, Sue and Rachel. In the Alexandria store, we only find the Hoe and Company. We only find 1 man. His name is Syphax. And in the later Hoe and Harrison ledgers from 1786 to 89, we have Jack Robinson. Now, we are still trying to determine whether Syphax and Jack Robinson were enslaved. But so if you know, please let us know. We're still trying to tease out what we can find from the ledgers. And so just like everyone else in the ledgers, these individuals with store accounts, they made purchases on credit and paid their accounts. They navigated the local economy with apparent autonomy, and their purchases were practical as well as frivolous, but their payments were generally made in ready money or services rendered to the stores or others. But these names only represent those with accounts. If we start to look at purchases made by them or on behalf of them inside other individuals' accounts, in Colchester, we have upwards of 29 individuals who were clearly enslaved or possibly so, as only a first name was included. Celia, Glasgow, and Milford were enslaved by the Colchester store. Betty was hired out to the store from Bertrand Ewell. Kate was a washerwoman enslaved by Elizabeth Fallon, who frequently washed the store's linens. And we have lots more to learn about Great Jack, Peter, Will, Billy, Prince, and Adam, plus several others who were simply described as Negro boy, Negro girl, or by their enslaver, such as Mr. McCrae's boy. By contrast, in Alexandria, 10 years later, nearly all the enslaved found in the ledgers have names and associated enslavers. We know Anthony and Ben were hired by the store from Robert Townsend Hoe, and Peter from William Ramsey, while Jack came over from Port Tobacco and may have been enslaved by Robert Hanson Harrison or the Port Tobacco store directly. George, enslaved by Elizabeth Hunter, was also hired out to the store, as well as the schooner John. In addition to George, the schooner John also hired 18-year-old Watt from Robert Hanson Harrison. Moses appears only once in connection with purchases made on behalf of him by Robert Townsend Hoe. And two unnamed men were enslaved by local doctors, William Rumney and William Brown, who both had leather breeches purchased for them. And finally, in September 1771, Robert Adam and Company paid £2 5 for passage of an unnamed enslaved man from Barbados on the schooner John. An interesting contrast between Colchester and Alexandria is the lack of enslaved women identified in the later Alexandria ledgers. So does this mean enslaved women weren't to be found shopping at the store? Probably not. We just simply need to look for other ways to find them than just by their names. So one way that we can learn more about the day-to-day lives of the enslaved through the ledgers is from evidence of hiring out. Hiring out may have been a much more common fate of many of the enslaved individuals who were residents of the town of Alexandria. Like the previously described Anthony, Ben, Peter, George, and Watt, although we find it in Colchester with Betty and Kate as well. So hiring out was the practice of renting your enslaved man or woman to another for a designated period of time. As the enslaver, you would profit from the arrangement and not be responsible for tithes or taxes associated with the individual during that period of hiring. Usually, evidence of the practice is limited to the occasional receipt found in an individual's private papers or newspaper advertisements, either advertising availability of or seeking enslaved individuals with specific skills. What makes evidence of hiring out in the ledgers unique is we can sometimes learn exactly what those individuals were doing. For example, in late February 1772, we find that at least 2 individuals were hired by the store from William Ramsey and Elizabeth Hunter to bail out the store's cellar. Courtesy of George Washington's weather journals, we know that at the beginning of February, a heavy snow took most of the month to melt, and by February 20th, although nearly melted away, heavy rains with a very brisk northwest wind meant that drainage around the town of Alexandria proved challenging. And if you've heard anyone from Alexandria fuss about the drainage today, it was even worse then. And so it required the store on the 21st, the 22nd, and the 25th to remove the water that had flowed into the cellar as a result of all that melting snow and rain. And what is especially interesting about this particular example is on the 22nd, Ducash paid Mr. Ramsey's Daniel for helping to bail the cellar. This means Daniel was paid directly. Ramsey wasn't paid, Daniel was paid. So now Daniel has money that he can take to the store to spend. So what about purchases made on behalf of the enslaved? Sometimes we have to read between the lines to figure out more about the unnamed enslaved individuals found in the account books. So if we exclude the ready money accounts for the moment and simply document immediate purchases and payments, focusing on the named accounts, how do we start to try to identify purchases made on behalf of the enslaved? The Colchester account of Richard Wilson provides us a peek into those kinds of purchases from 1760 to 61. Wilson paid for his own purchases by selling the store a pair of shoes valued at 5 shillings. The shoes were specifically described as being for Celia, a girl enslaved by the store. A week later, he provided an additional pair of shoes for payment for his purchases, and these shoes were intended for one of the enslaved boys or men, unnamed. If we go back one ledger, we can also see that Wilson has been soling shoes for Alan and Betty on behalf of the store. So in all, we are able to document 7 pairs of shoes purchased by the store as provisions for its enslaved that year. 5 pairs for men ranged in price from 3 to 5 shillings 6 pence. 2 pairs for women ranged in price from 2 shillings 4 pence to 5 shillings. These ranges were consistent with prices of over 40% of the shoes sold to all customers. So that means without the designation of who, like Celia, or for one of the enslaved men, we wouldn't be able to use shoes to discover enslavement. But the 7 pairs of shoes do provide us a small glimpse into who the enslaved associated with the store were. As I mentioned, the shoes were purchased for Celia, Betty, Glasgow, and Milford as part of their annual provisions. Using the ledgers, we know Glasgow. To learn a little bit more about Glasgow, we know that he was purchased from Benjamin Grayson in July 1759. Celia's purchase date has yet to be determined. Celia's and Glasgow's ages were adjudged to each be about 10 years old by the sheriff, who was provided 19 pounds of tobacco in the ledger. And it was then recorded in the court order book on November 20th, 1759. Celia was provided 2 shifts, petticoats, and jackets in March of 1761, and in November had a jacket and petticoat made in green baize, a coarse fabric with worsted, warp, and woolen weft. Say that 3 times fast, with a plain weave commonly used to line clothing or the backs of cabinets, but not as outerwear. Its vibrant color makes us wonder, did she select the fabric or did her enslaver? At the same time, Celia also had a handkerchief, shift, and apron made. The next time we find Celia in the ledgers is in November 1764, when she and her child, she would have only been about 15 years old, were sold to James Cleveland, who was most likely George Washington's overseer at River Farm at the time, and their purchase price was 90 pounds. By contrast to shoes, an object that opens the door to identifying enslavement in the ledgers was the hoe. Yet it was never overtly associated with them in its purchase. In Alexandria, we find only 2 purchases of hoes from 1770 to 73, which isn't unexpected given the more urban environment of the town and the shift in agricultural practices away from tobacco to wheat and, by extension, flour. The Alexandria store moved just over 1,100 pounds Virginia currency in tobacco during the 3-year period, but nearly 3,400 pounds in wheat and well over 7,000 pounds in flour. That's a lot of money, ladies and gentlemen. It also dealt in bags, herrings, staves, flax, and corn. By comparison, Colchester for the single year had as its primary payment of accounts in tobacco of 2,300 pounds Virginia currency and an equal amount in British sterling. There were 224,000 pounds of tobacco shipped to Glasgow in 1761 from the store. And that is, in essence, what all that list is all the examples of tobacco that was repackaged and reshipped and sent to Glasgow. So it doesn't surprise us then, in looking at Colchester, that Alexander Henderson, the store's manager, had ordered more than 450 hoes to be sold. And while primarily noted as broad, he also ordered narrow hoes. And given their wholesale prices, we can tell that they came in several gauges. And regardless, all of the hoes, all 450 of them, were requested to be strong, have strong or welded eyes. So the circle. During this particular year of 60 to 61, 96 of those hoes were sold by Henderson. They were described as broad, narrow, hilling, grubbing, and weeding. And all of those descriptions basically are the gauges. And each hoe retailed for between 3 shillings and 4 shillings 9 pence, which is not an inexpensive tool. So if we take a minute and look at someone who purchased hoes and look at Samuel Canterbury, he purchased 6 of those narrow hoes on February 20th, 1761. While no mention of the enslaved can be found in any of his accounts, he also purchased a large broadaxe, a 7-foot-long steel crosscut saw, and the associated file for sharpening it, and thousands of nails, all of which would be needed for constructing buildings, which was often the labor of the enslaved. He also purchased 7 gallons of rum in late July, which can be indicative of incentives provided to the enslaved during times of harvest. But did Canterbury enslave anyone? And for that, we do have to turn to outside sources. According to Beth Mitchell's interpretive map of Fairfax County in 1760, we can confirm Samuel Canterbury owned 170 acres adjacent to present-day Burke, Virginia, and enslaved 10 individuals. And we know from the Fairfax County Historic Courthouse records, Canterbury died in 1764, leaving 13 enslaved men and women to his wife Mary and niece Mary Ann. In Canterbury's will, he specifically left enslaved Eleanor to his wife Mary, and the remainder of his estate was to be divided 1/3 to his niece and 2/3 to his wife. Mary Ann Hill inherited Sampson, Sal, and Hagar. Mary Cleveland, who by the time of Canterbury's settlement of his estate, had remarried Eli Cleveland, the brother of James, who purchased Celia from the Colchester store. So Mary inherited Cato, Sue, James, Sarah, Peter, Millie, Di, Harry, and an unnamed child who was born after Canterbury's death, with their total value of 241 pounds. So the hose that Canterbury purchased would have been sold handleless. So it would make it the responsibility of the enslaved, those who were using the hose, to fashion the handle for their use to their personal preferences and the task at hand. So the hose would have been put to work almost immediately because the tobacco seedlings would have been about ready to go from cold boxes, cold frames, and go out into the fields and into the small hills. And so we have an idea of what that labor was like from Nicholas Creswell in 1774 in his journal, where he visited Nanjemoy in Maryland and saw, as he described it, 2 enslaved individuals plant 3 acres of tobacco plants and about 4,000 hills per acre in one day. It's a lot of work for those hoes. Colonial Williamsburg's historic farmer Ed Schultz expects it to be more like 3,000 to 6,000 transplanted per person per day. And from practical experience, he knows it takes between 10 and 14 strokes of that hoe to raise a hill about 18 inches wide and nearly a foot tall. Imagine being responsible for the creation of 2,000 hills every day for weeks on end. Assuming all 170 acres of Canterbury's land was under cultivation, that would amount to over 500,000 of hills of tobacco plants to be created, planted, and managed over the growing season with those narrow hoes purchased at the Colchester store. Their purchase amounts to a much larger exploration of what the lives of the enslaved would have been like, especially for those responsible for growing and tending tobacco in Virginia. So I alluded to wanting to pause on ready money for a moment. And so while purchases made on behalf of the enslaved, like the hose, requires to think about the purpose of a particular object to make the connection, another account type in the ledgers presents a similar challenge. So ready money accounts are literally just a list of everything purchased in a given month and totals. And it's a running list. And we can suppose, based on the journals, that that running list is the order in which something was purchased throughout the month. Purchases were often made of small everyday items that didn't cost large sums of money, small amounts of alcohol or fabrics, a few buttons or nails, a piece of tack to replace one broken during travel. The purchases are made in cash by individuals who are not seeking to or unable to have store credit. So through these purchases, we can only talk broadly about who might have made these purchases and how they came to have ready money or currency in a time that its availability was extremely limited. While we don't specifically know who made these purchases, we can explore how the enslaved would find themselves with cash to spend at a store, like Daniel. So for a moment, I want to turn to this from store ledgers to the personal ledgers of George Washington and the accounts associated with Mount Vernon. Personal ledgers from men like Washington and Thomas Peter here at Tudor Place, of whom you will get to learn more of, I think, in 2 months. There's another presentation that will focus exclusively on what Peter was up to. They are a valuable source of information to connect a place to the people associated with it. In the Mount Vernon Slavery Database, we find over 250 examples of payments made by or on behalf of Washington to his enslaved or those he encountered in his travels. Of those payments, 68 included names, 20 of which were women, both with names familiar to those who study Washington, like William Lee, Hercules, and One Judge, but also many others like Abram, Charles, Dundee, Esther, Joan, Joseph, Michael, Nancy, Poplar, Prince, Sarah Flatfoot, and Schomburg, just to name a few. And so just like those we find at the stores, payments that Washington made were provided for goods received, like honey, chicken, eggs, beans, and watermelons, for services rendered, like hauling seine lines during fishing season, especially on Sundays, for midwives or doctoring, for supplying teeth, for entertainment while in Philadelphia to attend the circus or a play, and for what Washington often called encouragement in times of harvest for enslaved overseers with their oversight throughout the year, and for holidays like Easter Monday or Christmas. With the money Washington provided, these enslaved individuals could have traveled on Sundays to the stores in Colchester, approximately 10 miles away, or Alexandria, approximately 9 miles away, and made small personal purchases for themselves or their families. The archaeological excavations conducted at the House for Families at Mount Vernon, one of the slave quarters, reveals that the enslaved likely did just that, with many items of evidence of many items of personal adornment, like glass and faceted clear paste jewel buttons that were used on sleeves. And like the green baize Celia had a jacket and petticoat made from as part of her annual provisions, we find 2 additional purchases of 1.5 yards green baize in the ready money accounts. And I have been told by a craftsman that that is just enough to make a jacket. And would that green baize have been purchased by someone who was enslaved to make a jacket similar to what Celia had? So it's kind of just it's more thought exercise than anything, but it's something that really makes me pause and wonder what were the items that were being purchased used for. So in my final example this evening, I want to turn to purchases made directly by an enslaved man himself. One of the most interesting stories to come out of the ledgers has been the ability to learn more about the enslaved community and its connections within the larger community, especially through the accounts of enslaved individuals like Jack. He represents an ideal case study of the enslaved experience in Colchester. He maintained an account with the store through every extant ledger, and based on the account header, we know he was enslaved by the estate of Mr. Linton. A search of local probate inventories provides a clue to who Linton may have been. Moses Linton died in 1752, 7 years prior to Jack's appearance at the Colchester store. At his death, Linton enslaved 18 individuals, and while Jack's value was only at 17 pounds, we can use that to assume he was fairly young at Linton's death. But regardless of his age, by 1759, enslaved Jack was acting as an independent carpenter with the freedom to hire himself out and shop in Colchester, over 13 miles away from his presumed home. So if you thought 9 and 10 miles was a long way to travel, try 13. To help pay for his purchases, Jack made furniture for the store, such as a chest, safe, wheelbarrow, table, and bookcase shelves. He sold to the store eggs and ducks. He worked for at least 11 different people who provided him credit toward his account, including the construction of at least 2 coffins. In 1768, we even find evidence of Jack hiring himself and his son to Alexander Henderson for over 6 months, which provided Jack 29 pounds, 5 shillings of credit at the store. And if you are wondering what that value is, at that time, Colonial Williamsburg historians estimate that your average journeyman, your average middle manager, was making 30 pounds per year. So in half a year, Jack and his son made the same amount of money that your average journeyman was making at the same time. Over the 10 plus years, Jack made 216 purchase transactions at the store. 44 of those were made by or on behalf of others, not by Jack himself. And these individuals were either enslavers or enslaved. An item Jack repeatedly purchased was rum, including purchases of it for enslaved Will, Joe, Tom, Milford, and Harrison. He even paid the store debt of joiner John Monroe, who enslaved Will. The ledgers provide 3 additional hints of Jack's personal agency: the rental of his horse, a way that he could get those 13 miles, primers, and shot, powder, and flint. In 1764, Jack was paid 10 shillings for the use of his horse. Whether this horse belonged to Jack or not is really irrelevant, as he was the one who was paid by the store for its use. Like today, horse ownership was limited to those with access to the resources to provide for it. The only purchase Jack made to imply he was responsible for the care of an animal was leading lines. No other tack was purchased. Although having access to the horse is inferred through credits for running errands and moving goods on behalf of the store and others in the community. Was Jack provided a horse by Linton's estate, or did he own it outright? Likely answer is he owned it, or the store would not have provided the credit to Jack, but to the estate. In 1766, Jack purchased 2 primers, which implies either he or someone in his household was learning to read, was reading or was learning to read. So contemplating Jack's literacy poses more questions than answers, unfortunately, but it does show his individual pursuance of an ability that many of his white neighbors had. And aside from his purchase of these books, we will likely be able to never know more about Jack's ability to read or write unless we can find some additional supplementary material. The final item purchased of interest is shot, powder, and gun flints. As of 1748, Virginia law forbid enslaved individuals from owning or possessing firearms, with a punishment of up to 39 lashes and the weapon seizure. Yet here was Jack repeatedly making purchases connected to firearms: 8 purchases of shot and gunpowder and 2 purchases of gun flints. Alexander Henderson would be well aware of the law, yet sold these items to Jack anyway. It is likely Jack used the shot and gunpowder for hunting, to supplement his family's diet, or to sell, like the ducks sold to the store, as he also purchased from the store sugar, molasses, pork, including a whole hog, beef, including a whole calf, salt, and corn. So, as you have hopefully gathered, the ledgers are very exciting to me. They reveal a myriad of ways that goods can tell the story of a community in places like Colchester and Alexandria, as well as more about the store's customers. They show that nearly everything imaginable was available, from yards of fabric to building supplies to even human beings like Celia. In addition, they reveal much about the operation of the store, from wages earned, rent paid, food acquired for consumption by the residents at the store, and hints at the daily lives of the enslaved, as well as its customers. For historically excluded communities, the ledgers have much more to tell us about individuals like Jack and their connections, as well as how the status of enslavement was understood by the Colchester and Alexandria communities. So as we continue to move the transcripts into this digital format through From the Page and our Shopping Stories website, we look forward to learning more from them, the ledgers, about the tumultuous decade of great political change in the Virginia colony, from a war with France to the founding of a new nation. And so before I take questions, I want to just say a big thank you to Tudor Place for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all this evening and share my enthusiasm for everything that can be found in these ledgers and the Shopping Stories project. So thank you all very much. All right. Okay.
When you were early in your presentation about tracing an artifact from store ledger to archaeology, someone asked, is it possible to do that in reverse, have an artifact and try to research back to figure out what store it came from?
So the question is whether or not it's possible to invert the history of an artifact. So rather than from its purchase forward to today being found in the ground, could I take an artifact and go backwards in time? In fact, the Fairfax County Park Authority did reach out to me to ask about purchases made by someone that they were researching at the time, and whether that particular individual had an account. They thought that what they were seeing were staples, and what it may very well be is part of a wool comb. I don't know if any of you all are weavers, but kind of combs, they go together, and they do have little metal kind of needly things. And so it is quite possible that the evidence that they found archaeologically were the wool combs that were purchased from the Colchester store. That inquiry is kind of the inverse of what I'm hoping to eventually someday do, is to be able to go into archaeological collections and see, can we do that backwards? And what's nice about both of these stores is that we actually have records of what was ordered and then in some cases what was received. So we can actually sometimes even tell what store in Britain things came from. So we can actually, and then, if somebody'd like to fund me to go overseas, I'd love to go to archives there and start researching, the manufacturing or particular stores there. So yeah, let's go. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any stores here in Georgetown?
Oh, the question is, are there any stores in Georgetown? Oh, yes, there are. There are quite a few stores, and in fact, both of the Glassford stores and the Hoe stores are interacting with them on a regular basis. So you can, I'm trying to think if there are any, and I believe the Glassford stores, there is in fact a Georgetown store, but it's called the Rock Creek store. And so that's phase 12 of my project, is to start expanding beyond just these two communities and start expanding outwards, because we see in them a lot of interaction between Maryland and Virginia, a lot more than you would imagine. You think of the Potomac as this huge overcomable body of water. It was not. And so that's one of the things that I hope to be able to ultimately pursue, because Port Tobacco is one that there's a lot of back and forth communication. And so I'm interested in picking a few stores in Maryland to continue the exploration.
The ledgers are available.
So the ledgers,
They're not been compromised
No.
over time by
Well,
water or-
so all historic documents have damage of some sort. So the Library of Congress is the repository for the John Glassford and Company store ledgers. Depending on which archivist you get during the day depends on whether or not they're going to bring you out the original or they're going to direct you to the microfilm if you go to the Library of Congress. Because I've had it happen both ways on visits. They are not always complete, in that, there may be sections of the book that are missing. The Glassford materials came into the collections at Library of Congress in 1899. So there have been lots of archivists over time who've had their hands on them. And so I know from looking at the microfilm that things are not in order. Like there are stores that are even mixed up. I've not looked at the books to compare to see if the books are bound incorrectly as well, if maybe it's just the microfilm. But when you get a volume, usually at best you're missing the front or the back, but the volume itself, the meat of it is generally intact. So if you want to dig into that, let's connect afterwards. I'll be happy to have your help. Yes, sir. All the way in the back.
How and why were these ledgers saved, and how did they get into the public institution?
Okay, so the question is, how and why were they saved and how did they end up in their respective repositories? The mystery of life is how they were saved. They were in someone's attic. To that, I don't have a good answer to that. Coming to the public repositories is a little more straightforward. So I know that the New York Public Library had a mission at one point to collect economic related documents. So they looked for these things to be for sale and up for auction. And so that collection was preserved because it came up as a lot at an auction somewhere. There are some really nice ones at the National Archives that were part of court cases and things like that I'd also really like to get my hands on, that are specific to Alexandria. And you can find all kinds of interesting things. Some of them end up in courthouse records. In fact, there is a continuation into the 1820s of the Hoe related ledgers. A later 1820s related ledger ended up in a court case, and somehow it's at the courthouse. Don't know why. But the timing is also what's curious to me often. Why did this huge collection of material from the John Glassford and Company store end up at the Library of Congress? It's anybody's guess. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, so this is a tremendous presentation.
Thank you.
Very, very, very good. Very informative. Have you been able to find any impact on these stores with non-importation movements around sugar and tea and other
Okay, so the question is, have I identified non-importation agreement impacts on the stores? So that is the period that we are still transcribing. But what I can tell you are things like in tracking the price of rum. Interestingly, when the Stamp Act comes into being, the price of rum grows significantly, and we start seeing continental rum instead of West Indian rum. So we start to see them manufacturing things locally. Sugar is surprisingly affordable when you actually look at the ledgers. I mean, we talk about in history books, they talk about how expensive sugar was, and surprisingly not as expensive as one would have expected in the grand scheme of things. But I have yet to see it. I've yet to see people not buying it as a result of it. I have yet to see people turning to coffee, although it is sold, over tea. What is interesting to me is I do not see a lot of chocolate being sold, which was also a competitive drink for tea and for as a breakfast drink back in the day. So if any of you all like to drink hot chocolate in the morning, go for it. You are historically accurate. Embrace it. Although it usually was a lot thicker than your normal Swiss Miss. So yes, bohea tea and green tea were very common. If you have never had bohea tea, I highly encourage you to check it out. If you like whiskey from the Highlands, you're really going to like bohea tea. You're really going to like bohea tea. Green tea was the very expensive. Bohea was the everyday tea that everybody drank. And as you can probably tell from my description of it, it also is an illustration of how people were nose blind, because my guess is they did not smell it. And when we go to drink it today, it hits you. It hits you as soon as you go to inhale. So, yes, sir.
Have you found any cases where a store or stores are known, but there are no ledgers? Ledgers are missing.
Oh, all the time. All the time. More ledgers are missing than there are found. So someone I would love to find is two competitors of Alexander Henderson and Colchester, Hector Ross and Benjamin Grayson, are both big movers. Hector ends up in Alexandria as well, but his ledgers that I know of do not exist. I'm always keeping my ears open for other opportunities, but that's where I would really like to see the collection grow. Because right now we have not a lot of overlap between stores so that we could actually do a direct time comparison of what someone in 1765 was purchasing at this store versus what they were purchasing at that store. And that I think would really help tell the story even more. So if you know of any, let me know. Yes, ma'am.
Are there ledgers at the library?
Yes, there are. There are lots of ledgers there as well. Thankfully, a lot of them are on microfilm, so it gives you the ability to kind of interlibrary loan them, or other repositories have copies of them. The other nice thing about the Library of Virginia is that they also have a lot of the things that are from Great Britain on microfilm as well, so you can do kind of a comparison of records in some way. So anything, they did a very big push, I think in concert with Colonial Williamsburg, to basically do a colonial records search. So they went overseas and they went through as many repositories as they could to collect them. But there are Alexandria-related ledgers there. There are Alexandria-related ledgers at the University of Virginia. There's Alexandria-related ledgers at Duke. There's a couple of repositories in North Carolina that have them. I think there's even one in Kansas. So, yes, ma'am.
I was wondering about Jack.
Yes.
Is there a thought, a theory, a hypothesis that perhaps after his enslaver died, that he became freed, or he's living independently somehow? It was unclear to me.
Mhm.
Clearly, you don't know.
Right.
But what would you guess? So
So the question is, what was Jack's enslavement status, and can we tell? In the ledgers, he is referred to from 58 to 69 as being connected to Linton's estate. Every time in the header, it repeats every year. We can assume, based on comparing what happens to women and their accounts, we can see women transition from being unmarried to married and underneath their husband's account to then having their own account again when they are widowed. So we can actually watch the women, and the store manager is very clear and changing the how the account holder, that header on each one. Interesting you should ask that, because just today I was looking at another account holder by the name of Abram Barnes, who is often providing goods to Free Jack. I don't know yet if Free Jack and Negro Jack, as we have referred to him, are one and the same, or if we have two different Jacks.
What's the timing like?
Same.
So after
But-
69 is when Linton died?
So Linton actually dies in 52. And so when we see Jack appear in the ledgers in 1759, he is attached to Linton's estate.
Oh,
So
estate
he's-
meaning
So deceased.
not
Yeah, correct.
land.
Correct. And so Linton's property is basically at the border of Fairfax County and Loudoun County, up the Occoquan River. And so the presumption is that Jack lives, that is where Jack lives, because that is where he is attached to the estate of Linton and his heirs. And so over time, as the estate goes through the course of probate and distributing all of the goods and the land and the money that's attached to it, Jack would have just sat there. Now, what would be interesting to know is with the disillusionment of everything having to do with the estate, if there's anything to know more about Jack. And I believe, unfortunately, that period of time, so Heather Bollinger, who's here to your right, works at the Fairfax County Records Center, Historic Records Center. That's the time period that the county records don't exist.
Yeah, that's kind of
So it makes it really difficult to know what happened to that property. And then once we get to the revolution, all bets are off. So then what you have to do is hope to find the property after the revolution, and what I often refer to as begat deeds, where somebody has to prove how they came to own it. So it's came from this person, came from this person, came from this person, came from this person, came from this person. So they have to, because there are no documents, they know there are no documents in the courthouse, they have to document how they came into possession of it to sell it. I am ever hopeful, because we have so much information about Jack, that we will be able to find him somewhere. We just have to keep, so my way of thinking, we just have to keep looking in different places than we have already. And maybe he shows up in somebody's diary entry or a letter that we find that survives.
And you think that in 52, when Linton died, based on Jack's
Price, yes.
that he was young?
Yes. So in terms of enslavement, your value is based on your value to be productive. So when you are young, your value is low, and when you're old, your value is low. In between, you're worth a lot of
Young like
money.
a child.
Yes, generally under the age of 12 is the metric. Heather, do you?
Commentary, I guess, like on Jack. So before 1782, it took a literal act of the General Assembly to emancipate someone. You had to petition the governor. So if William Linton did not, is it William
Moses.
Okay. Is it Moses did not emancipate him in his will, then, when he purchased his freedom some other way, he could be going about the county and working on his own behalf. And we didn't have registration laws in Virginia until 1793. So, unless, I don't know if we should check and see where for Moses Linton by the governor.
Mhm.
So yeah, that would be the one thing that to look out for.
But you mentioned the community's attitude toward
Mhm.
enslavement
Mhm.
status, so it could be that he wasn't officially emancipated.
Right.
but
Correct.
there was an attitude to let him act independently.
Right.
Because of the status of Linton having died and the estate being
Mhm.
in the process of being settled.
Yeah,
and what have
yeah.
you.
But, and that's one of the things that speaks to how the community perceived of enslavement, that they were like, okay, well, your enslaver died. Meh, go forth, prosper, do what you need to do. Just, don't cost us any money.
Freedmen could also own guns. They could not
Mhm.
present them at muster because they were part of the militia. If they got them, but free people were able to own guns. So that's another thing to think about.
Mhm.
Because he is in the accounts with
So he's buying
Mhm.
guns
Mhm.
and shot.
Mhm.
guns, and he
Yeah.
might not have a-
Right.
Well, what would Litton's wife role have been? What happened?
So the question is, how would Linton's wife be affected by all of this? She would basically have rights to until she died. So the inheritors would have been Linton's children or his brother's children or that kind of thing. So as far as the women were concerned, you get the right to use the property, but it's not yours.
It didn't pass to her second husband.
No, it would always pass to basically the children. And if Moses and his wife didn't have any children, invariably it would pass to Moses's siblings' children, because they want it to go to the next generation. They don't want it to go to the greedy land grabber who maybe married you because you have lots of money. So, yes, sir. Or yes, ma'am. You had one more question, I think. Yep. Yes. Oh, by all means, please, please.
But I am very curious about this. So one of my questions is, when the store managers were doing the ordering, would it be the kind of thing where maybe you would go in and say, I really want this thing from England, could you order it for me? Or was it more them ordering based on spec, what they thought they could sell?
So the question is, were the orders made directly by a customer, or was it just what the store manager wanted to order? Yes. So there are examples in the orders of customer wants this gun. And then we can later see the gun being purchased in the ledger by said customer. There are lots of opportunities. There's lots of times in the ledger where it says per order. Sometimes per order means I sent a note to you and you filled it and you sent a guy out to me to bring me the order. Sometimes it means I sent you a note, you don't have it, you have to ask it for it in Glasgow and have it shipped. And so I will be waiting months for things. And in fact, there is a ledger from 1753 to 56 in Alexandria that is mostly what that particular storekeep moved in. He's ordering all kinds of crazy exotic things for people, and that's all he does. So, and I think you've got time for one more of your lots of questions.
Do you know how profitable running one of these stores was, and does it change kind of over time as you approach the American?
The profit margin on these is not great. That much I do know. I do know that the store manager in Colchester is always trying to get Glassford to start a store out west because we'll make more money. And really what it boiled down to was the tobacco market. When the tobacco market was bottoms out, then nobody wants to bring their goods to the store. And now you're sitting with merchandise because no one has any ready money to spend on big quantities of things. I do know that all of the Glassford stores all close up shop during the Revolution. Just getting started with the Hoe ledgers to know how the Revolution impacts them. And I'm excited to get to see that. I know I've got glimmers of it. The Revolution specifically, when we see them talking about taking night expresses to go see what ship is off the coast, off the point, and where are they coming this way? And so you've got men on horseback riding madly through the night, taking a ferry across into Maryland, down the peninsula of Maryland to see, and then riding back and taking the ferry back across. And you can kind of actually see that documented in the ledgers day by day. But I look forward to learning more. And so that's, for me, that's part of the fun of these ledgers, is that there is always something new and more to be learned. If I just get a new question that I have to go looking for the answer to. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you, for joining us this evening. I was heading that way, Rob. Thank you all for joining us. Those of you who joined us here at the Dower House, as well as those who've joined us online. I do want to invite you to our next program. It is Tuesday, May 16th. And this is a change from an earlier schedule. It's a week later than had previously been advertised. So if you have it on your calendar as the 9th, change it to the 16th, okay? It's going to be Walter Hawthorne of Michigan State University and Darrell Williams of the University of California, Riverside. And they'll be talking about Peoples of the Historical Slave Trade, or Enslaved.org. It's an online discovery platform that has opened new ways to understand individuals and community life experiences in slave society. So please join us to learn more about this, the work that they're doing, and this really powerful research tool. We also extend an invitation to our next Tudor Night that's coming up on May the 4th. At this event, we'll be sharing objects in the Tudor Place collection that commemorate the American Revolution. And the exhibition it will start with an exhibition in the main house and be followed by a lively reception here in the Dower House afterward. I would note this event is free if you're a Tudor Place member. So I'm extending an invitation to all of you who are not members to take the opportunity this evening to do that. In addition to great benefits like discounts on the shop, free admission to Tudor Nights, it's also a great way to support the preservation of this National Historic Landmark and all of the programs that we're doing to share its stories, like the program this evening. Again, Molly, that was extraordinary. Your knowledge of the subject and your passion for it is really indescribable. And this has been encouraging for us as well, as we're on this journey of trying to center the stories of the enslaved here at Tudor Place, and facing challenges in it. The records are not always where you think they're going to be, and certainly don't compare with the records that we have of the Peter family. And so I think you've given us some insights that will be helpful to us in the work that we do as we carry on. Before we finally close, I want to thank the team here at Tudor Place who have worked to put this lecture series and this program, particularly this evening, together. Rob DeHart, who is our curator, also our cameraman, running the show there. Stacy Queen, our Director of Education and Visitor Services, greeted you at the front door, as did Haley Wilkinson, our archivist. And in an undisclosed location somewhere else on site is Katie McCarthy, who is monitoring this online to make sure that everything looks good for those who are joining us. Yes, in an undisclosed location, so that those who are joining us online have a great experience as well. You can learn more at tudorplace.org, more about our programming and opportunities to support the organization. We look forward to seeing you again at another program, hopefully at the lecture next month. As you leave by the front door, there is a brochure that describes all 6 of the programs in this year's lecture series. And so I want to encourage you to pick that up. It's right next to the place where the membership brochures are. So pick up one of those as well. So again, thank you all for joining us. Have a great night.